Thanks for your time tonight.
Good evening, Brian. Very good to be with you.
You're an ethicist.
Well, no, not exactly, Brian. I'm an Australian.
Can't you be an ethicist and an Australian?
Well, that's a very good question, Brian. That's an excellent question. It may not be impossible, but there have been some recent changes. We're trying to work our way through those.
What sort of changes?
Well, if you did a bad thing in order to get a result and you got a result, then you hadn't done a bad thing.
Didn't you just say you did do a bad thing?
No, not if you got the result you intended to get, Brian. You obviously
Well, who says you got a result?
Well, you do, Brian. You would need to establish that.
To whose satisfaction?
To your own, Brian. You're the person trying to argue that you hadn't done a bad thing.
But hang on, the hypothetical argument you just gave me, you said you had done a bad thing.
It would depend, Brian, on when the bad thing was done.
Well, before you got a result.
If the bad thing was done prior to getting a result, Brian, you hadn't done a bad thing.
So the argument works backwards.
There is some retrospectivity, Brian, in the way the new ethical standards are applied, yes.
Well, what would happen if you hadn't got a result? Would that have been a bad thing?
Well, not if you could establish that the result would have been worse if someone else had got it.
Wasn't the result a bad result?
Well, Brian, the question there would be, would the result have been worse if someone else had achieved it?
In whose estimation?
In yours, Brian. You're the person trying to establish you hadn't done a bad thing here.
But hang on, wouldn't it have been better to have not done a bad thing in the first place?
Indeed, Brian, and the whole purpose of this argument is to establish that you didn't.
But this is a bit of a change in the way we think about these things. I mean,
It is.
It's not really about ethical standards at all, is it?
It is about ethical standards, Brian, but importantly, it is about ethical standards in the context of reality.
And who defines reality?
You do, Brian. You're the person trying to establish you hadn't done a bad thing here.
But real ethics deals with this subject all the time. Wasn't the UN Constitution largely written by an Australian, Doc Evans?
It was, Brian, and in fact the Human Rights Declaration was brought in by the UN under the presidency of an Australian.
Doc Evans again.
Indeed.
Because everyone knows Australians are very honest people and very fair-minded.
I think the view of the international community, Brian, is that perhaps the jury's still being tampered with on that question.
Isn't this all to do with the separation of powers?
It is, to a great degree it is, indeed, yes.
Can you define what the separation of powers are?
Yes, the separation of powers, Brian, is the vital constitutional distinction between the Parliament, the Executive and the Judiciary.
And they're all completely separate?
No, they're not, but it's a lovely idea, isn't it?
It's a terrific
It's a
idea.
beautiful, beautiful idea.
Does it work?
No, not in the estimation of the Parliament and the Executive, Brian. That's the trouble. This is what we're working through.
Thanks for your time tonight.
Welcome.